Inconstant Worlds is a podcast following the meta-disjointed journey through the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. I am Kat, she, her, and I am really tired.
I am Megan, she, her. I am also really tired, but a lot of that is self-inflicted, so I take my own medicine because I'm a dumbass sometimes.
Isn't it mostly self-inflicted all the time, though, of like, you choose to engage in life?
Look, I feel like sometimes I'm tired because of life obligations, like making money and having to eat sustenance and things that are genuinely necessary, while other times I make choices like staying up too late to listen to a true crime podcast or adopt a puppy, both of which are choices outside of basic necessities and also deeply infringe upon my much needed sleep.
That's fair. So, for this episode, we are on location at Megan's house.
Woohoo! Thank you so much for being the traveling podcast.
With said new puppy, so you might hear puppy in the background. It is not JJ and Rocket this time.
Oh no, Ginger is in the house. She is tall and a menace, as puppies are, but also really sweet. And I'm hoping to high heaven she will get bored and take a nap. We'll see. Fingers crossed.
We'll see how much she likes to hear about Stephen King's writing process. Also, word of warning, pollen's been really high, and I know I'm dying from allergies. I don't know how you're holding up, but...
Ish.
Yeah. Allergies are rampant in our life right now.
Enjoy the background sneezing and snotting.
Yeah. I will try to edit as much of it out, but man, sometimes we just gotta be able to breathe. So, we fully support trigger warnings and taking care of your own mental health. So, here are the warnings for this book and thus this episode. I'm going to remind you, we're reading a book supposedly about writing, but no. So, car accident, injury detail, medical content, substance use, substance dependence, cursing, death of a parent, racial slurs, cancer, alcohol, vomit, medical trauma, blood, bullying, death, gore, mental illness, sexism, and terminal illness.
No wonder we both feel tired.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. So this is the hopefully the end of reading On Writing by Stephen King. We read from the section titled On Writing to the end, and I feel like we got a lot more of the actual writing advice in this section, which we barely touched on at the end of the first one.
I have questions.
I doubt I will have answers, but we can present the questions to the universe and see what the universe says about them.
Fair enough. I trust you. I trust the universe will figure it out.
Yeah. So this begins with a mix of King's personal feels and writing advice. It is probably more clearly connected to writing than the first half was. Regardless, this book is definitely nothing like what I had expected. The section actually titled On Writing begins with King stating that while he'd like to say there's no bad writers, there are. King's pyramid of writers is as such. Bad writers at the bottom, competent writers next, then the really good writers, then the geniuses. And if you're wondering, no, King does not count himself among the genius group, which I was impressed by, and I feel like I shouldn't be. We also finally get the two theses of this book, which is good writing consists of mastering the fundamentals, defined as vocabulary, grammar, the elements of style, and filling your toolbox with the right tools, and that it is impossible to make a competent writer out of a bad writer, and equally impossible to make a great writer out of a good one, but it is possible with hard work, dedication, and timely help to make a good writer out of a competent one.
Yeah, so 2 of the 4 levels he's just written off.
Yep.
But you have to get through almost 2/3 of the book to hear that.
He also details a muse who sounds like a giant douchebag. His muse is a dick, and maybe that's why he's kind of a dick.
I love that you noted that as well. I was shook. The muse is a man, because of course it is. A giant douche.
Oh my god, he was such a douche. The description of this muse, I'm like, why would you even listen to that guy? I'd punch him.
And that's the inspiration of it all. That muse.
Yeah, and in fact, you know what? I'd punch him and then write a story about punching him.
I would read that story, and I would probably enjoy it more than I enjoyed this book.
King then goes on to say that to be a writer, you need to read a lot and write a lot. Mm-hmm. He talks about the large amount of books he consumes in a year in a mix of physical and audio format. And while he doesn't read to study, he is learning something as he is reading. This is because all books teach you something and bad books can teach you more. I have thoughts on that. We'll get there.
He's also really not shy about pointing out bad books, bad authors, bad dialogue writers. He calls them out by name shamelessly and without hesitation.
Because his ass reflects on author Murray, I think it was Leinster.
I think so.
And his love of the word zestful.
Oh, yes.
Which I find really fucking, like, ironic given King's, like, obsession with apotheosis. When he was talking about, like, oh, he just recently, like, got into the word zestful and I've never used it in a novel and hopefully I never will. I'm like, but you really got into apotheosis, sir.
He has his own zestful. It's just a different word.
Yeah. And I'm not sitting here declaring I will never use apotheosis. It's a good word.
I like that word.
It sounds really cool. It looks really cool. Mm-hmm. Like, it's a great word.
Use it in a sentence for us.
I don't know that I could. I was not prepared for that. This is like naming the 5 countries.
For the lovely listeners right now, we grabbed lunch before this, and we're talking about how there's always some like very common knowledge that you don't know, and you don't know it until it comes up, and then you're a little embarrassed that you didn't know it. So Kat very helpfully brought up, try naming 5 countries in Africa. And I'm embarrassed to say it took me a minute, but I did get there.
Yeah. His apotheosis is his zestful. Stephen King, should you ever hear this, you use apotheosis like that dude sounds like he was using zestful. Maybe not as much, but still you're doing it.
Dial it back a bit.
Yeah. Kettle, pot, all of that shit. Anyways, he's talking about lessons learned from reading an unevenly written book by that dude. Then this book goes on, and I do have to say it feels a bit like a pillar of its time. I will remind you, it was originally released in the early 2000s. He started writing it in 97. And I do wonder what it might be like if it were written today in a world where everyone at least needs 3 side hustles just to survive.
Yep.
Because, Mr. King, I would like to tell you something. I don't have time for either reading or writing, despite how much I would love to do more of both. I listen to some books while I'm working my day job, which is not writing. Most writing I get to do is these scripts. And they're maybe not the best of scripts, but they're good enough. They're not the apotheosis of scripts.
And there it is. The sentence with it. Thank you.
So King tells this anecdote about his youngest son and playing the saxophone. If you love something, you do it until your fingers bleed. But his kid didn't want to outside of like the set practice times, to which I have 2 things to say. The first is, feel this, because I was stuck trying to play the trumpet for a brief period of time, and I didn't want to practice even during the set times. And 2, this is advice that's maybe a little toxic.
Yes.
I get when you love something, you want to do it a lot. There's an obsession that comes with it, but obsession is not always safe or healthy.
I think that a lot of the advice we get throughout this book is very Stephen King specific.
Yes.
And is not always noted as such. Sometimes it is. This is what works for me, the disclaimer. But here's what works for me and you should do it. And the millions of steps that go along with that. But I do think that yes, it helps when you're passionate about something because it will fuel you through when it gets hard.
Yep.
But also as a grown adult now, I do hard things sometimes, despite them being hard, because I have determined to do so. And so I think that level of passion to obsession is not necessarily required to be masterful and enjoy something. But, I didn't write a book about writing, so there's that.
No, I agree. Obsession is not always healthy. Even if you love a thing and it's not a harmful thing, anything can become harmful.
I also think that he's talking about this in the context of writing for commercialization, for money making. And I would argue strenuously that taking something you love passionately and making it a job may effectively just crush your joy and love of that thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and I think that that's interesting too, because I made a note about his like, oh, you shouldn't write just to make money. And it's like, that's bullshit. Like today it's bullshit.
I would say too, his entire writing from when he was a very young child was designed to make money. He sold the newspaper copies to his classmates. He was not necessarily writing all the time for fun. He was writing with the purpose of earning money.
Yeah, exactly. Like you want to be able, the dream is to support yourself writing if you like writing.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, the whole, like, if you do what you love, you never work a day in your life, which is also very toxic. Don't do that either. Because it'll just make you not love the thing you love anymore because you turned it into work now. Healthy balance for everything. Whoever made these sayings up was wrong and probably just trying to make themselves feel better about stuff.
Oh.
But he does talk about, like, don't write, like, purely for profit. And maybe he doesn't write purely for profit, but he sure shit writes for profit.
You're not going to tell me he didn't write this shit book just
right?
for some dollars.
Right?
Sorry, it's not all shit.
But there's this episode of The Simpsons it's actually a really good episode. I think the episode's called The Book Job, and it's in a later season. The only downside is that Neil Gaiman is in it, and now we know that he is trash.
Boo!
But in this episode...
Not to say I don't still want another Good Omens, because I really do, and I'm sad about it. Sorry, go on. Whenever Neil Gaiman comes up, I immediately think, boo, and need more Good Omens.
Thankfully, Terry Pratchett was heavily, he was part of the writing team there. And maybe we can have it if we just cut out Gaiman.
I stand this.
Yeah. But in this episode of The Simpsons, Lisa ends up accidentally discovering that one of her favorite authors isn't real, but rather a conglomeration of several grad students churning out chapters for a book and then stitched together. And Homer hears about this, and he's like, I got a great money-making plan then. And so he and Bart assemble a team to churn out a Twilight-esque, book, a tween novel.
And who is in this brain trust?
It is Homer, Bart, Principal Skinner, Patty, one of the twins, one of the sisters.
Selma and Patty.
Yeah. So Patty, Dr. Frank, yeah. And I think, and Mo.
I mean, of course, Mo.
And then Neil Gaiman. They don't let Neil Gaiman write, though. They make him the coffee getter. And I think that's everybody who was on the team. And they all had different strengths for why they were going to be here. So they basically sit down and they make a story about trolls at a, Underbridge Academy. And they're going to school and they make up a game, kind of like how you have the game in Harry Potter and shit like that.
Okay.
They come up with everything. And they end up selling it to Andy Garcia because he's basically playing his character from Ocean's 11. He's the publisher, because this entire thing is run sort of like an Ocean's 11 movie, where we're getting those weird cuts with music. Because all the while they're doing this, Lisa is trying to write her own book and she's failing because she's can't get herself to sit down and just write. And so they sell their book, and they basically are as they're going into the meeting to sell the book, they're told, you have everything, but where's your fake author? You have to have a fake author with an inspiring story. And so they go and grab Lisa because then she'll be able to motivate herself and shit like that. And she agrees to go through it. They make a bunch of changes to the story, and the team gets really upset because they ended up very attached.
Of course they
to
did.
The books that they worked together. Ultimately, Lisa's trying to go on through with it because she's like, yeah, they said I can write the sequel, so this will really motivate me to write the sequel.
But you only have to sell your soul to do it. That's all. She
ends up swapping the drive, so they end up printing the original book that the team had made. But the real twist, spoiler if you don't want a spoiler for this episode of The Simpsons, this old ass episode of The Simpsons.
I think your time is coming past, dudes. If you don't know it by now, you're welcome. We're gonna fill you in.
At the very end, it gets printed with Neil Gaiman's name. And they're like, fuck Gaiman. And the very last scene, and this was hilarious, and it's really sad that Neil Gaiman has betrayed me because he does the voice through this of himself, is like he's on a beach and he and Mo think that they have gotten away with this for a while, but then he's also betrayed Mo at the end of the episode, and he's looking at the book that now has his name on it, because Lisa was still expecting her name to be on it. And he has this line where he's looking at to the camera and he's like, the best part is, I can't even read. Solid episode. And you think that this isn't a thing that happens, but we live in a time where we know that there are ghostwriters.
Yeah.
I followed someone on TikTok who would just kind of explain how ghostwriting worked.
Ooh.
And I would also like to point out, James fucking Patterson! Okay? There's also a joke about how he's written everything. He's in every section of the library. You will find a James Patterson book, right?
How many of those did he actually write?
That's the question, isn't it? So, James Patterson.
What are you about to tell me?
A Google search, a quick internet search, just told me that as of 2023, once all of his announced books in 2023 actually came out, he would have 368 books. And Patterson is only almost exactly 6 months older than Stephen King. 368 books. Stephen King hasn't even topped 100 yet, and we would call him prolific, right? There's no way James Patterson is writing all of these books.
Is that disclosed or no? Is that just sort of like a...
I think...
Wink, wink.
I think at some point it started to get out a little bit, and that's when he started, like, co-authoring with people. I don't think he was actually writing some of the ones, like, earlier until it started to maybe get out there a little bit more. Because, like the ghostwriter person that I used to follow who would talk about the business, people would ask her, did you ever ghostwrite for James Patterson? And she would have to say, like, I can't talk about who I have and haven't ghostwritten for, but James Patterson absolutely has to be using ghostwriters.
And here's why.
Yeah.
How much do they get paid?
Not great.
For doing the work, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm of the impression, like, it depends. It's like a by word thing.
Okay.
And also, what like she would explain is that you may only be asked to write a couple of chapters, and then somebody else is asked to write a couple of chapters, which is why sometimes your story gets really weird.
I would think that would create continuity gaps and voice and tone.
Like... Exactly. And so I've never read a James Patterson book.
I have.
Did it seem like it made sense?
They're so thick. Like, they're generally pretty big.
Yeah.
That honestly, meh. Like, there's just so much information to process that I wouldn't have noticed, because I'm like, that didn't really seem to stick, but I'm just going to keep charging.
And I think that that's what people expect, is that, why would you notice? It's James Patterson. You're just blowing through the James Patterson books.
Yeah, they're like at least for me, they're the books I would grab at like an airport.
Exactly. And so that advice of like, don't write purely for profit is not true here in 2024. There's no way. Because ghostwriting would not be a business. It would not be an industry you could really get into like that.
I don't disagree, but I think like anything we were talking about earlier, there's moderation.
Yeah.
I think there's a spectrum of writers. I do think there are those that absolutely have created the well-oiled machine, the Patterson, the ghostwriting, that are all part of that machine. And then I think there are some that are, no, I'm writing for what I love, and this is my jam, and this is my passion project, and this is my...
Oh, absolutely.
My reason why. And then everything's sort of in between.
Yeah. Because I do. I feel like you can tell. I don't pick up James Patterson books.
If you have a long flight, they're not that bad.
And hey, that's great. I can't say that there's ever been one, because I remember there used to be ads for when he was releasing those Maximum Ride, like, books. And the fact that he has television ads, which is really weird to me.
Oh, that is sort of strange.
Like, of all the things in the world, James Patterson also advertises on TV. And I'm vaguely interested in the book. I think he did one with Dolly Parton. Oh. I kind of want to read that, but that's because I love Dolly Parton.
I like Dolly. She's good.
You know? So I vaguely want to read that one, but I have a feeling it was mostly like Dolly Parton had an idea and they probably hired ghostwriters to actually put it together.
Execute it.
And then James Patterson probably acted more as like a final editor, final pass, if he did anything in it at all. I feel like if you're working with Dolly Parton, you should do something.
Agreed.
Rather than just lend your name to a thing.
I mean, you would if you're smart. Dolly's phenomenal.
But I know now there are some books that come out with James Patterson Presents. And then it's the title of the book and who actually wrote it.
Oh, I kind of prefer that over the behind-the-scenes ghostwriter that never gets their name on anything.
Exactly. And they sign contracts that sign away so many of their, like, rights to that stuff. And, like, I know she was explaining, like, what you find out about your story kind of just depends. You can get something super vague because maybe somebody just, like, couldn't write a chapter and that's all you're doing is one chapter for them. But sometimes you're writing whole books.
If the pay's not good and you're not getting your name and exposure out there, is this just struggling authors trying to get some money for writing?
I think so, yeah. I think it's a lot of people who they want to be able to eventually sell their own book, because if you can go up and be like, to the publisher that probably hired you to ghostwrite, since you can't disclose who you wrote for, hey, I have ghostwritten for major books. Mm-hmm. I can't tell you who, but this is how many projects I've been on. Here's what I've been paid. Here's my book.
Starts a resume of sorts.
Yeah, it's a way to, like, kind of
carries a lot less weight without being able to name drop. Like, yeah, this is the book and these are the chapters I wrote. Like,
yeah.
Okay, well, you ghost wrote what? The first page? The last page?
Yeah. Yeah, Stephen King explains a lot of things about writing. He talks about how important writing spaces are. He likes to have a closed door, which I can't blame him. I like that too. In a world with cell phones, that's also harder. And he wrote this before there were cell phones. Mm-hmm. I mean, he might have had one. He was wealthy enough, probably.
Yeah.
But he also explains that if he doesn't write every day, he starts to feel lost. And yeah, fine, that's fair. I've been there.
Well, I also feel like he is very vigilant about the routine and the consistency. Yeah. And I think you could do that with anything, right? For me, it would be in the mornings if I don't take my morning, like, steamy hot bath. Like, I don't have quite as good a day, or it doesn't feel like it's off to the right start. For some people, it would be going to the gym every day. And if for some reason you have to miss gym day, you don't get that piece of your routine. So I understand what he's saying, but I also don't know that it's like you have to love writing so much that the part of you is aching without it. I think it's just...
No, sir. I believe that means it's your hyperfixation.
I was just going to go, it was part of his routine. So when you take that piece out, you miss it.
You might be a little neurospicy. Love that he addresses the write what you know advice that I'm sure everybody hears all the fucking time.
I'm not going to lie, though. I read that part and then I just wrote in the margin, Carrie, in all capitals.
Well, and I think that's the thing, is he explains, like, how there are limitations to that.
I'm still butthurt.
No, that's fair. I do feel like that one was a little out of pocket, like, how he got to the point that he thought he could write that one.
Again, maybe like, write what you know, but with the caveat or asterisk next to it, or solicit information from those who are in the know. Yeah. Although, sorry, research is also part of what he chats about in this book.
And I mean, to be fair, Tabitha did help him with the parts he didn't know with Carrie, so there's that.
Yeah.
But he does make, a solid point of, you and I don't know how to kill people. We've never done that.
Not actually.
Yeah. But I've definitely written murder scenes. I don't know murder, but, and also, like, while there are books by murderers, I do think that there's probably some level of moral issues depending on what the fucking murderer is writing about. So I'm not going to dive into that bit, but I will, like, state that I know that that's a thing.
Let's take a hard pass on that.
Yeah. But he does state that we're, like, start with where you know, but then let the story just kind of develop outward. For King, he says that a novel consists of 3 parts. The first is narration. I don't believe he explicitly stated what he meant by that, but he implies that it's how the situation grows. Next is the description, which is the sensory participation for the reader, and dialogue, which gives voice and defines characters. He explicitly excludes plot because our lives are plotless and plotting spontaneity isn't compatible. Clearly, he's a pantser. But the way King explains it is that his stories are based on situation which does explain a lot about his weird little stories about how these books came to his mind.
I noted that he really has an anti stance on, I said, what the hell do you have against adverbs, pronouns, and plot? And I'm not going to lie, his emphasis on character development, is this in line with what that character would do? Is this who that character would be, what they would say? And he uses the example of like one character and them stealing something and then it being, that would be entirely out of his character. But don't plot anything. For the love of God, you'll ruin it all if you have a plot. And in my mind, the plot is the through line. It's the how I get from A to Z in X amount of steps with my characters. And I wanted to ask you, as a reader of the prolific Stephen King, do you see, because I listened to the pod, no shock, do you see a lack of plot or where the plot might be missing in the books of his that you've read?
Yes.
I suspected as much. I feel like sometimes when you're only going on the characters and how they react to the situations you put them in, then what? Then what the hell happens? And I think you get halfway or 3/4 of the way through some of these novels of his, and you get to that, then what spot? Or the then what is freaking weird. And not in like a fun, oh, you meant to do that way, but in a, how the hell did we get here?
I would say that yes, that absolutely happens, because I know he gave the example with like Misery and like what he originally had planned for that. And it's like, damn, I'd have liked that book better. That book would have been amazing. I would have really jammed on that book. There's so much time that you just see like Paul writing or some shit like that. And it's like, I don't really care this much. You could have probably skipped this. This isn't really building it out. But that's also partially because I didn't like Paul.
That was my next point, because you brought up Misery. He was very specific talking about his character development in that book.
Yeah.
And how much fun Annie was to go into and try and make both psychotic but also human.
Yeah.
And very multi-layered, which I think he accomplished beautifully.
Yes, absolutely.
There were moments where I was horrified at how much sympathy I had for Annie.
Yeah.
Like, just mentally, my conscience going, you are picking the wrong person to root for. And the rest of me going,
Exactly.
But with Paul, he said it was harder because Paul's just a good guy.
He's not
had bad things happen to him. I'm paraphrasing here.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, that giant D-bag? Ugh.
Yeah, I will say, I think I was supposed to have much more sympathy from him, and hearing what he says about Paul in this book, yeah, I was supposed to sympathize at least a little bit more with Paul than I did. No one deserves to have their foot chopped off and be held hostage.
But if
it doesn't make him a good person, though, just because he dealt with it.
It also made me suspect that Paul's douchebaggery was not intentional.
Yeah.
And that was concerning to me.
No, I think that's true of a few, like, of Stephen King's characters. That their, like, douchebag is not. It's that muse, I guess. Maybe that guy is just, like, featuring in every fucking book.
Just driving the train.
Because, like, I think about The Mist with David. David was also a piece of shit I couldn't stand. He was a douchebag. Jack Torrance is a douchebag. Roland's kind of a douchebag. I, at least at this point, not even finishing the first Dark Tower book as we've gotten so far, I still prefer the Man in Black. You know why? Because he doesn't pretend to be anything else.
He is exactly who he is.
Yeah, but like Roland, Jack, and Paul, they all present themselves, and David, as nice guys.
Yeah.
And we know what a nice guy is here in 2024, and we're not here for it.
It's nothing good.
The Man in Black tells me exactly who he is from the get-go. He is not a nice person. He is not a great person. I don't have to pretend. He don't have to pretend. And obviously he doesn't always do that, which we saw in The Eyes of the Dragon. He presented himself as, you know, a different character. And Flag is not a great dude. but he does not lie now, at least.
It's interesting to me because I feel quite confident in saying for both of us in real life, we prefer authenticity.
Yes.
Even flawed.
Yep.
Even ugly, even dysfunctional or cruel. I prefer to know flat out and straight up what I'm working with.
Yeah. I can respect that so much more.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me that I also prefer it in my fiction.
Yeah.
I prefer the characters, I gravitate to the characters that are exactly as you described, the man in black, who are who they are, even if who they are is dead-ass evil. I prefer that over the nice guy that's actually the wolf in sheep's clothing. There's nothing nice about you, sir. You're dysfunctional, toxic, and a mess, and you pretend to be otherwise, and then you create havoc on others with guile and deceit and a lack of self-awareness.
Yeah, that is very much the character that Stephen King makes a lot, is this dude who, I don't know, maybe at some point he was considered nice or good, but I wouldn't classify Paul as a good man.
No, and he actually did, not good necessarily, but like Paul seemed to be a very bland, sort of quote unquote nice guy in his mind. And I just thought it was so funny he thought of him that way.
Yeah, I did too.
I remember listening to your podcast about Misery and really struggling with my allegiance, which character I was rooting for.
King also discusses symbolism, pace, backstory drafts, research, and regularly repeats the importance of honesty of all things, ironically, given what we just discussed. I don't think he thinks of his characters as being dishonest or not authentic, but...
Do you think it's the characters, though, or the honesty of him writing what he knows? Because that's sort of what I interpreted that as.
That's what I think it is just what he knows.
The honesty of writing your personal experience, because that will make the most sense. And extrapolating that however you need to, and sort of morphing it into different characters, but writing it from your most honest self.
There was loads of writing advice. It's really hard to cram it all into here because legitimately there was actually writing advice in this part of the book.
This last third of the book was incredibly informative into his process.
Yeah.
Although I have thoughts.
Yeah. We do also get a bit about after the accident because after the event that nearly killed him, he got struck by a van and...
while jogging or walking.
Yeah. And should have died. He got very lucky that he did not die. It sounds like a very slight pivot is all that was the difference between him living and dying. And he was very fortunate. And I do honestly think he had to have had some sort of universal prophetic level of knowledge that this was coming. Because he did pivot just a little bit and it saved his life. And he entered the hospital on June 19th, which... 19 is his big number through
that's right.
The Gunslinger, which, I mean, I know he ended up rewriting it later, so I don't know. Actually, I'm almost positive, even in the unabridged that had come out before the rewrites. So we're talking long before he had his accident. 19 was the trigger word to find out what it, like, death was like, basically. It was going to unleash the info you didn't want to have on the woman in Tull that the Man in Black had set up, basically as like, I know at some point you're not going to be able to resist saying 19 to this dude who died and that I brought back, and he'll tell you everything you don't want to know.
Ugh.
And he writes Paul Sheldon's accident.
You just have those life-changing moments. I know that's cliche, I know whatever, but like you have those, the birth of a child, the death of someone close to you, and a near-death experience. There are those quintessential moments in time that profoundly change you. Yeah. And I think this was one of those. I think there was also someone who was on scene with him who performed CPR and did all the right things. And without that person, he probably wouldn't have survived.
Yeah. And happened to do all the right things.
But he had been in that, he was in the medical field and had known exactly what to do. And so it's interesting that with that chance, one chance encounter could have taken his life, and one additional chance encounter that person was able to save it. Obviously, for anyone who's listened to this for more than 30 seconds, I've really struggled with this book. But him writing about that experience was the only time I found myself truly enjoying his writing.
Fair.
When he wrote about that accident and detailed it, and it was him, it was his style, but it had a through line. It had a beginning, it had a plot. It was the telling of this profound, horrific thing that happened to him and the aftermath, and it was engaging, and it was interesting, and it was incredibly well written. For all the shit I'm about to talk, this man can write. He can write well. He's an insanely good, if not great writer. And I really, truly enjoyed that particular section of the book. Not the horrific thing he went through, but the way he told his story, I thought was really insightful and well done.
It was very well done. So then let's open the pile of shit.
Do you think Stephen King read this book?
I think he read it on a lot of painkillers.
I found myself time and time again, and I have a couple examples, but I'd need to flip through my margin notes to get them all, of where it's like, wait, but you just said the opposite. You just said this other, you were saying, so one of the instances that I in particular didn't care for was he was railing against laziness with your writing. And again, I'm paraphrasing. So if you are a person who wants to sit down and watch TV for an hour, you do not have what it takes to be a good writer. And then in the next page, very next page, I'm not even talking like a chapter later, he's talking about his daily process. I get up in the morning, I write for however many hours it takes me to get this many words. I then go hit the gym or I exercise for an hour, spend time with the family in the evening, sit down to watch the Red Sox play baseball on the television. And I'm like, excuse me, sir, did you not just say that assholes like yourself are never going to be good writers if you're wasting time watching television? He talks in so many absolutes and occasionally notes, well, this is what works for me, or everyone's different, but then goes back to this just asinine tone of, you have to do this, and if you don't do this, it's basically, you're never going to amount to anything. Like, you can just hear this voice in the background with that wagging finger in your face. And I would think, for such a prolific writer, if you took this book and read it from start to finish, you would find the half a dozen examples of that contradictory nonsense that I did, and perhaps decide to change it up a little bit.
Well, then what kills me is, like, there are some incredible, like, stories you can experience only through television. Like, there are shows, there are movies, things like that they never were books.
I didn't even think about that.
You know? So, I mean, a Red Sox game ain't going to teach you anything other than about baseball, but there's not really, like, a writer behind that. But I think about, like...
Well, even the baseball, though, you could take from that the authenticity and honesty of what it feels like to work that hard and then lose. Like, there's nothing more painful than watching a team who's on the precipice of glory, or a pitcher who's been a phenom for the whole season and then for one reason or another just doesn't have it that game. Or the one person who, like, makes the bloop, who drops the ball, and that's the game-winning home run. There are some very real human moments that happen there.
Yeah.
That can be very instructive. You can see those, take from those,
which he also tells you to do, like, watch people.
Yeah.
Like, you have to sit there and you have to be a little bit of a creep about it. It's fine. You know? Watch people. That's how you develop, like, realistic dialogue and realistic interactions. And it's just like, yeah, no, you need to.
I'm going to take
cut yourself off anything.
That is my takeaway from this entire podcast. Be a little bit of a creep about it.
There are so many stories out there to be experienced, and not all of them can be experienced in a book.
Yeah.
You know, because he had also mentioned, like, shutting away, like, games. And at this point, video games have wildly developed stories. They have to. Even the ones that seem like they don't have one. There's Taryn was telling me about, they were playing a game called Power Wash Simulator. And they were saying, like, you know, apparently, like, if you pick up the notes, there's this crazy story about, like, a volcano actually happening in the background.
Oh.
And it's stuff like that of, like, you think it's this power wash simulator where you're just spray washing things. But in reality, if you pick up stuff, apparently, there is a story in that game that you wouldn't think was there.
Oh, I love that.
Exactly. So, or Five Nights at Freddy's is another great one where you think it's just a horror game where you try and survive the night. But we have people like, you know, Game Theory, Matt Pat, who's looking at the little clips of the story on like the walls and shit like that. Turns out there's a massive story in there, and now they've got 10 billion games, and the story makes no fucking sense anymore to me. But it's not the point. The point is that there are stories everywhere.
Oh, I love that.
You just have to pay attention, and you can find them.
There's stories everywhere. The other thing that I particularly noticed where, I don't know if it's just he's working up to his point and gets a little convoluted getting there, or if he doesn't just want to come out and say every time, this is my process, you do you, but my way works, so you should do it my way. He was talking about the pacing of a story.
Yes, that pissed me off so much. Sir, I've read your books.
Well, he said he prefers a slower pace.
Yeah.
And he's talking about how people are, you know, the critics or general public will say they like a fast-paced book, but that your readers will get whiplash and they won't be able to really enjoy the ride. And then he goes on to say, your second draft should be your first draft minus 10% so that you pick up the pace. And I'm like, that doesn't necessarily contradict each other, but it isn't really in alignment either. Pick a lane, sir. In what you were saying to me, pick a lane, own said lane, and stay in your lane. There's this constant weaving in and out of, and there's not even an acknowledgement that the weaving is happening. It's like somebody who's really high in the car, bebopping around with no consciousness of anyone else driving around them, or that they should even try not to like hit something. They're just enjoying their trip. And as a reader who's expressly looking for instructions on how to be a good writer, I found that ride insanely annoying. I want a driver who's got a purpose, who knows where we're going, and takes the most direct, clear route to get me there, to my destination. That was not this book.
I think that the way that this book was presented was poorly done. And I don't know if that's him or the publisher or someone else who decided to put this together.
Did you read the part where he brought this idea to his publisher to write this book?
Yeah.
I was a little stunned. I had always sort of assumed that someone brought this to him and offered him a lot of money to do it.
Yeah.
Because it didn't seem like he particularly enjoyed it.
Yeah.
If I'm just being really honest, it didn't seem like something he was enthusiastic or excited to write. It felt like a laboring of sorts for him, the author, as well.
Yeah. Well, and he admits as such. The only reason he went back to it was...
Oh, that's right.
Because he nearly died and it I don't know, it spurred on creation.
I also think he'd just become too invested. He'd put too many pages down already to just walk away from it.
That's fair. That's fair.
Is it, though?
I mean, it wasn't all bad. It's not great. I do have some problems with Stephen King's voice as Stephen King. And I mentioned this on the last one. I make the joke all the time is nothing makes you realize what a bad writer he is other than having to read a lot of Stephen King for a podcast. And I think that's part of why I was glad that he doesn't group himself in with the geniuses. I wouldn't say really he's not a bad writer.
No.
But he is somewhere in the middle of his pyramid. And that I think is good. Because truthfully, I do disagree about the existence of bad writers.
I think there's undeveloped writers.
Yes, I don't agree with his crap of like, oh, you can't make anything out of the bad writers. And it's like, no, you can. You just have to try. But it sounds like you weren't the greatest of teachers, sir.
I was just going to say, it scares me that this man was a teacher. To write off an entire group of people who maybe just haven't had the time and the investment and the care and the exposure to the stories around them, but who could, with some nurturing and kindness, really be able to explore their skills. I don't know. I think there's so much bullshit around. You shouldn't try something because you'll be bad at it. Guess what? Most people are bad at things the first time they do them, and the first 10 times they do them, and maybe the first 100 times they do them. The way you get better is by practicing.
Yeah.
And if we all don't do things or pick up new things or try because we're bad at them to start, no one's going to get good at anything.
No, it's true, because it's... So the 20th anniversary, which I know we technically have 2 separate copies of this that are like, I think you've got the 10th anniversary version possibly, and I have the 20th.
Mine's pretty.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But regardless, we have 2 separate versions of this. They mostly are the same. But the end of the 20th one, because it includes his list of things from 2019 and an interview with one of his sons, and then a little blurb from the other son. But the list of the books that he read around 2019 while he was working through one of his novels or a couple of his novels included a book that I've tried reading multiple times. It's by an author I actually enjoy.
Okay.
But the first time I tried reading it, I tried reading the physical copy, and I could not get through it. I got further in it when I tried it on audiobook, but I still finally just DNF'd it at 38%. It was not a book for me.
What was the roadblock that you couldn't get over? Because you were not one to set down books.
The pacing.
Oh.
The pacing. It is a slow fucking burn story. Because and I didn't really care for the characters, which is a huge problem for me. If I can't attach to any of your characters, I'm not going to be able to finish. I was not really harmed when J.K. Rowling came out as a piece of shit because I never really liked Harry Potter that much because I didn't like any of the characters. The one character I liked was Sirius Black, and as soon as he died, I just noped out of the series then.
Okay.
I don't need the rest of this because the only dude I cared about...
You murdered.
Yeah. So, peace. And I left. The characters felt very awkward, and not in a realistic awkward way. They just did not feel relevant. And the author had held so many of the cards back for the plot that it's supposed to be an intrigue thing, and you're supposed to really want to know. And it's you need to give me a little bit more. You've held so much of it close to the vest that I don't care anymore. I don't care what you're holding in your hand now. I'm walking away because I'm bored. And there's a story over there that I think I could be really into.
So I'm going to go explore that.
Yeah. And its pacing is just better for me.
Sure.
But it is on his list of a book that he read, and I'm of the impression these are books that he thinks are at least worth reading.
Yeah.
Either because they're good or bad. I don't know which one he categorized them as.
I'm shocked he didn't create a list, because really he was not shy about calling out his favorites and his not favorites. And for someone who was really challenged by criticism some of the time, I was shooketh at how open he was at being a critic himself.
Yes. And this is why I struggle with the idea of bad writers and bad books, frankly. Because, I used to be pretty open about, oh, that book sucks, that's a bad book. But the reality is maybe I'm just not the audience. Mm-hmm. The book I'm referring to that he possibly enjoyed, I know tons of other people did enjoy it. They were super excited because the sequel just came out this year, and they were, very ready for it. They got super into it. I didn't. It was not a book for me.
Well, and he references Steinbeck with a lot of reverence. And
yeah.
I friggin' could not stand Steinbeck back. And you want to talk about pace. Good Lord. And so I think that's a really lovely point. This, any book could be a book that is just not for you. Ooh, that brings me to an interesting point.
Okay.
What did you think about what did he call them? The reader. The ideal reader. He went on and on about this idea of an ideal reader. So when you write, allegedly, You are supposed to write with one person, for him it was his wife, your ideal reader in mind, and how they would think and feel about what you're writing. And I'm curious how that landed for you, because I had a pretty visceral response to it.
I kind of sat back with that. I'm like, well, who would my ideal reader be if I was actually like kind of following that? And it's like, I don't know, because a lot of times when I write, a lot of the stuff that I write is because I can't go find that book.
Ooh.
It's the whole like, well, if you can't find it, then I guess you gotta write it.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, yeah, I can't find what I actually want, so I guess I'll do it myself, as Thanos said. In the end, I largely write so that it's done. I did it.
Is it fair to say you're your ideal reader?
Probably.
Because I know for me, my damn near temper tantrum when I got to this section was, I'm my own motherfucking ideal reader. I write for myself. And why on earth would I pick an audio? I feel like it just goes against the integrity of everything we've already talked about your honesty and writing from your personal experience and your perspective, et cetera, to then, as I'm writing, have to hold someone else's opinions and regard in mind, and how would that person respond to this character or this thing in my plot, because by the way, I write with plots a lot of the time, thank you very much. And I understand that he uses his wife as a beacon to keep him on track. Like, I think that was his point.
Yeah.
But I don't give a shit about that.
Well, and I think that's the thing, is that I feel almost like he says these things are X, but in reality, you know, they are Z. He just doesn't register them as being Z, because, like, his situations, they're plots.
I agree with that completely.
Like, they're, like, he can say, oh, I write situations, and it's like, that's your plot, my dude. He's still making plots. He's not doing a plot. He's just calling it
something different.
Yeah.
So he would create situations and then in his mind go, how would my characters respond to this situation? Yeah, that's a plot. I'm with you. But for whatever reason, he feels more comfortable in his process framing it a different way.
And I wonder if that's because it gives him permission to change things. Like, the ending of Misery was originally planned to be so different, but he gave himself
better.
Yeah, kind of. Legitimately, like, when he summarized, I'm like, oh my god, that would have been such a good book. That book would have been, like, my favorite if we had just done that, man. Why didn't you do it?
Write a plot, sir.
You know? I think it gives him the permission that if things start to deviate when you're typing, when you're writing it out, it's okay.
It gives him an out.
You know, because I can't tell you how many books I've read where randomly we get this scene that's so well done, and you can tell, like, oh, you're somebody who probably does believe in story beats, and that's your preferred approach to this. This was your beat, and you had this beautifully planned out scene. But our narration, to use Stephen King's, like, terminology here, the narration that got us from point A to point B, and point B is the scene you had in mind, was weak. You did not actually give me strong narration because you couldn't figure out how to get to your
next
beat
spot.
So rather than let yourself deviate because the story did not develop that way, your narration did not develop into what you were anticipating getting to do, you forced your narration to go down that path and went, no, you can't. You have to stay on this line.
Physically making guardrails with her hands.
Yeah. You know, you have to stay in this pathway. You cannot deviate because we have to get to point B. Rather than, turns out, we ended up over there on point W.
So I think instead of adhering to the plot, his situations are a plot with room.
Yes.
Just room to maneuver, room to grow, room to change your mind.
Yeah. I can say I probably write closer to how Stephen King does, where it's just like, okay, you threw down a writing challenge. I had no idea how my story was going to end. Mm-hmm. And when it ended, it just ended. I didn't even expect it to end.
I did love that he was surprised. He talked about being surprised by how some of his stories ended. And that's a really cool trick if you can surprise yourself Right? Like, if your creativity, imagination, and story can take you in a place you didn't expect to go, that sounds like a hell of a fun ride.
Yeah. And generally, I can say when I sit down to write, I don't typically know how it's going to end.
Mm.
I have some idea of like where I think it could land, but other than like one story that I've written and I never finished it, I don't have like an ending planned for most shit that I write.
See, I love that, but I also think you could do it exactly backwards. You could have the ending and not know how you got there, and then track backwards to figure out the beginning. I think there's so many different paths you can take.
That's part of what's fun about spoilers and knowing them. It's like, how do we get there? How do we get from point A to point Z?
Once again, things ran a bit long, so there will be a part 2 out tomorrow, October 31st.
You can email us at manyconstantworlds@gmail.com, DM us on Instagram, and check out our Patreon. All links can be found in the description of our episodes.
We work really hard for the Patreon, and Megan gets mad if we don't say that.
We work hard for that money.
So hard for that money.